Okay, hi again, everybody. This is going to be the last introductory lecture for our course from Sophocles to Swift. We're going to be going on after this lecture to our main readings, starting with Sophocles' Oedipus the King. That means we're going to be, after this lecture, starting to talk about and to pursue our main kind of theme or line of inquiry for this course. And there certainly is one, as I have put in the course title. We're going to be talking about models of discovery and recognition in a series of texts beginning with the ancient world and going up until the 18th century at the end of our course. The texts our main texts are certainly very diverse in various ways, historically, culturally, and otherwise, but they are all, in their various ways, about learning, about how we learn what we need to learn, how we understand what needs to be understood, perhaps in situations of tragedy or crisis. That's what I've called getting it in the course title, and I take it this is a unique and a very, very important phenomenon, which is going to form the continuous subject matter of our course beginning after today, as we pursue it through some very, very diverse and very difficult texts. These first lectures, though, including this one, have been more basic, more introductory. I've just been trying to talk in a general way about how we can orient ourselves toward the study of literature as an academic exercise, how we can approach it usefully, how we can find ways to say something about this phenomenon of literature. So this lecture will be rounding out our first module, so we're kind of at the end of the beginning here, and accordingly I want to do a little bit of review as well as a little bit of a forward glance at what we're going to do in subsequent weeks and in the rest of the course. So a little bit of review. What have we been talking about for the last couple of weeks as we have made our way into this course? Well, I've been urging two attitudes, two ideas, two ways of thinking about our approach to the study of literature, which may be a little bit in tension, or maybe we could even push that a bit more. We could say they're even a little bit contradictory. But I happen to believe the contradiction or the tension is a very valuable, necessary, and productive one. So on the one hand, I've been arguing, as you guys will know, that in a sense there's nothing special about literature. These texts that we call literary, they don't exist on some other level from ourselves or from our ordinary lives. They are not in some essential way mysterious or transcendent or beyond us. There's nothing to be afraid of, let's put it that way, when we make our approach, our academic approach, to texts that get called literary. What are they, after all? Well, all they are is various extended exercises in communication. Communication in words, reaching out to us, reaching out to the world by way of making something intelligible for the purposes of understanding something, in other words. Now that communication in words, reaching out to others, reaching out to the world, that's just what we do, right? As human beings, there could be nothing more ordinary than that. And so this first thing that I've been arguing, and which I want here to make even more explicit, that I have been arguing it. This first thing or point or approach or attitude for which I've been arguing is that we approach literature as not different from the ordinary business of communication in words, but actually as an instance of, as continuous with the ordinary business of communication in words. Just calling it literature doesn't necessarily make any immediate difference to that totally ordinary and momentous business. And I came up for the purposes of this lecture with a very goofy little example of what I'm trying to say. I hope you guys find it more useful than goofy, but anyway, here it is. So suppose you come down the stairs or exit your room or wherever in the morning. In your home, you go into the kitchen and you find a note on the counter. The note says, "Hey, don't forget your lunch." Don't forget your lunch. Well, among other things, that means somebody in your life, whether it's a parent or a roommate or a significant other, cares about you and doesn't want you to go hungry during the day, so that's great. Don't forget your lunch. This little communication. You know, I dare say that when we see a text like that, "Don't forget your lunch," there's some ways in which we do not react and would, I think, never react. And if we do react in these ways, we may need to think about our mental health a little bit. When we see that note, "Don't forget your lunch," I think none of us goes, "Oh my gosh, what does that even mean?" Right? I don't know how to understand that mysterious utterance. Probably none of us goes either, "Oh, that's so beautiful. Don't forget your lunch." No, we don't react to an ordinary communication in words in any way like that. We know exactly what it means. This is a message from another human being to us, conveying a certain kind of imperative information, namely that we should not forget our lunch. It's as simple as that, right? Couldn't be more ordinary, couldn't be less mysterious. You see that note, you are reminded, you grab your lunch from the fridge. A communication in words, reaching out to you and reaching out to the world. And yet, by that token, it's very evident, I think, that this little sequence of words, "Don't forget your lunch," well, that's what we can call a text, right? And we could write it out more formally, and we could put it in a book, and we could call it a poem. So there's my poem for today. Poem, I'm calling it. Poem by J.D. Fleming. Don't forget your lunch. A goofy example, as I said, but I think it allows us perhaps to reflect and to ask, what happens when you take the ordinary sequence of words, "Don't forget your lunch," you call it a poem and treat it as a poem, and there is nothing to stop us from doing that, right? What happens if and when we do that? Well, clearly the utterance, the sequence of words doesn't suddenly or magically become a different kind of thing in any way. This sequence of words that we found so easy to understand, "Don't forget your lunch," it doesn't suddenly become hard to understand because we call it a poem. It doesn't suddenly become magically beautiful because we call it a poem. It's exactly the same kind of thing it was before. It is a communication in words, reaching out to you, reaching out to the world for the purposes of understanding something. Now, maybe when the note becomes a poem, we can say that it is calling our attention in a new way or in a special way to the whole phenomenon of communicating in words, reaching out to others, reaching out to the world in order to understand something. When it becomes a poem, perhaps it makes us notice that ordinary phenomenon, but the text itself remains exactly the same kind of thing it was. You see? And this then again is this first idea that I've been urging you guys to take on, or at least to consider, as a baseline approach for the academic encounter with literature. It is not strange, it is not mysterious, it is not radically different from the ordinary business of communicating in words. It is that business, that ordinary business of communicating in words, but in such a way that we reflect more than we otherwise would on just what is at stake, what is entailed in that very ordinary business of linguistic communication. Now, my little poem will almost certainly not become a classic. That makes me sad, but I have to accept that's how it is. But I was inspired, to my goofy example, by a poem that I added to the Canvas page, so it is there for you guys, but I also brought it here in this kind of Gilligan's Island format. It's this poem and this, by the way, as English Lit adepts in the room will know, including your TAs, this is certainly one of the most famous poems of the 20th century, okay? By the American poet William Carlos Williams. The poem is called "This Is Just to Say." And Williams writes in this very, very famous little text, he says, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious. So sweet and so cold. Williams's poem is a little bit like my "Don't Forget Your Lunch" poem, although I think in many ways it is more memorable. But it seems to me that in what I hope, again, is an interesting and useful rather than merely goofy way, it seems to me we can use a poem like this one to get a grip on or get a look at excuse me, to get a grip on or a look at this radical ordinariness of literature that I'm trying to talk about, or the way in which a text that we call literary is not by that token cut off from or transcendently different from just any old ordinary text at all. So we did a goofy trick, I did a goofy trick on the "Don't Forget Your Lunch" note, turned it into a poem. We can do the same procedure in reverse with Williams's poem. So there's Williams's poem written out just as a note that you might find on the kitchen counter. You've heard of deplatforming. This is depoeming, right? We're depoeming the text and just turning it into a little note which says, "This is just to say that I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox in which you were probably keeping for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold." And clearly, again, what happens when the poem becomes a note is absolutely nothing in one sense. The text remains exactly what it was, exactly the same communication in words, reaching out to the world, reaching out to the other, the auditor of this poem, by way of making something available to the understanding. The text in that way remains completely unchanged. What happens to that note in its poetic form? Well, maybe we could say not that it becomes, strange or transcendent, to beat that drum one more time. Not that it becomes strange or transcendent, but maybe that our attention is drawn toward its very ordinariness. Maybe when the note becomes a poem, we're given an opportunity or a challenge, maybe, to perceive the strangeness in the ordinary and the wonder of the ordinary, even the beauty of the ordinary. That's real, for sure, as an effect of the note that becomes a poem. Our attention is drawn not to something not to something different from ordinary communication, you see, but rather our attention is drawn to ordinary communication. Our attention is drawn to communication in words precisely as something that is special, that merits our attention, that demands that we pause over it and think about it. Maybe we hear the sound of that icebox, old-fashioned fridge, opening and closing, and maybe we notice the deliciousness of the plums. Maybe we taste them in their sweetness and coldness. Nothing could be more ordinary than that. But the poem, as a poem, makes us look at the ordinary all over again, makes us, perhaps, as I've said several times now, perceive it or have an encounter with it in its specialness, in its strangeness. The banal becomes fascinating, the ordinary becomes strange. We look in a new way, with a new freshness maybe, with a new intensity at this ordinary business that we are performing and participating in all the time. The ordinary business of communicating with others in words about the world. I'm going to stop beating this drum in seconds, I promise, but I might just add one more banal, goofy little example onto the pile before I do that. The kind of effect that I'm talking about here, and that I think a poem like the Williams poem makes available and evident, it's a bit like what happens, and you guys have all had this experience, I bet. It's a bit like what happens if you say a word to yourself too many times. Elbow, for example. You say elbow. Gee, I'm hoping, even as I say this right now, that I'm not the only person who has ever done this. I'm talking about the kind of experience when you suddenly hear the strangeness of a word that you take for granted. Gosh, elbow, is that really the word? That's a weird word. Strange sequence of sounds. The ordinary becomes strange in a moment like that. And that defamiliarization of the familiar, that, I think, is part of what literature does, and part of this baseline attitude that I'm urging for our academic encounter with or study of literature. So that then brings me to the second thing that I have been urging over the last several lectures, and which I want to make even more explicit here today. I said there were two ideas or two attitudes that are somewhat in tension or in contradiction. I've just been going on and on for the last few minutes about the notion of ordinariness as a baseline for how we approach these texts that we call literary. The the countervailing notion, or the notion in tension with that, is one that you've heard me talk about a lot over the last several lectures. It's precisely to do with the strangeness of the literary text, or to put that slightly differently, excuse me, the strangeness of the text that we approach as literary. I've been urging you guys, when you enter into that kind of literary classroom space, cognitive space, I mean, interpretative space, when you see or handed a text that has literature written over it, it's a poem, it's a play, it's a novel, whatever, I've been urging you to look for the telling details, the things that don't fit, the things that are odd, the things that seem problematic or out of place or without justification, the telling details that make you sit up or go, oh, or what's that, or oh my God, or whatever. And these have been examples to do a little bit of review from the last lecture and the tutorial that followed it. Things like those glasses in the Joy Kogawa poem, which we looked at in the last lecture. Tim, my brother who wore glasses, she said. Why the glasses? Why is she taking the time to draw attention to that utterly ordinary and banal and forgettable and vague detail? You know, it's not even my brother who wore horn-rimmed glasses, or my brother who wore glasses with the nose piece taped up. No, my brother who wore glasses. A telling detail. And what I was arguing when we were looking at that poem together is that's the kind of thing, as students of literature, that's the kind of thing that we need to put a finger on and say, hey, that's weird. There's something going on there which I don't understand. And because I don't understand it, I want to try to understand it. Here there is a problem that I want to try to resolve. And the resolution that I have gestured toward for that detail in the Kogawa poem, and this is a resolution which I hope was made available by the trailer for that ridiculous movie. That's why I shared that with you guys. The resolution is, look, it so happens that glasses in the 20th century functioned as a kind of racist, stereotypical signifier of Japaneseness. The bespectacled Japanese man. That's the significance or the value of that symbol. So Kogawa, in that poem, in a way that I think is very, very smart, very skilled, as well as very subtle, she's deploying that maximally ordinary item of personal furniture, a pair of glasses, because it functions as a token of racist stereotyping. She's putting that in her poem, I'm arguing. She's putting that detail in her poem, not because it's interesting, the glasses, but precisely because it is so ordinary, so banal, so forgettable, and precisely as ordinary, just a pair of glasses. It functions in the poem to remind us, to bring home to us the injustice, the absurdity, the cruelty of racist stereotyping, the kind of stereotyping that led to the internment of Japanese Canadians, including Kogawa's family, during the Second World War. It's just a pair of glasses. But in that context, that pair of glasses functions as a racist symbol. And again, what I'm doing with that poem, even right now, does not approach the level of kind of writing an essay about it or anything like that. I think what I am doing, and what I was doing in the last lecture with this poem, is trying at least to identify, to sketch, to draw circles around some potential elements for a productive discussion about a poem like that one, or indeed of any poem or text whatsoever. I'm arguing that in Kogawa's poem, the ordinary becomes strange, and she's daring us, calling upon us to notice the radical ordinariness of those glasses as a detail in her text. If we can notice that, if we are alert enough to go, hey, what's up with those glasses? We have begun to have, I think, a very productive encounter with that poem. and we've given ourselves, I think, interesting work to do. The other example, which I didn't have time to get to in the last lecture, but left entirely for tutorial, was, of course, the poem The Book of Yolek by the American poet Anthony Hecht, a poem about the Holocaust, and that becomes evident just as it were from an initial reading of the poem. It's a painful memory of the murder of a child in one of the extermination camps of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The detail, of course, the extremely formal detail that is of very great interest for us in the Hecht poem has to do, as I hope you will have had a chance to discuss in tutorial, it has had to do with the repetition of those end words. The same words at the end of every line in those stanzas of 6 lines. The same end words repeating over and over and over again, stanza after stanza after stanza after stanza, for 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, and then the end words repeat yet once more in the 3-line stanza that concludes that poem. Why the repetition of those totally ordinary end words: meal, walk, to, home, camp, day, day, meal, camp, walk, home, to, camp, day, walk, to, meal, home, over and over and over and over and over and over. And why? And again, the first part of our work, the first step of our work, and the step without which we cannot do any useful work whatsoever in the literary classroom. The first step is just to notice, right, that there's something in that poem that we need to figure out. We need to notice the repetition of those end words. And I mean, which isn't to say that it would be easy to miss. It's a it's a fairly obvious effect of Hecht's poem. Nonetheless, by that token, I think it makes the point very clearly. We can't read that poem and walk away from the repetition of the end words. We can't do that. We can't just say, oh, well, I guess, you know, he liked those words or something. Or we can't even say, or rather, I'll rephrase, we must not, I think, even say. Well, Anthony Hecht wanted those repeating end words because he wanted to write this very formally demanding kind of poem, which goes back to the Renaissance. It's called a sestina. That's a poem, 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, end words repeating stanza after stanza after stanza. We can't even just say, oh, well, Hecht, you know, he was a really smart guy. He wanted to show off. He decided he was going to write a sestina one day, and so he did. No. We can't do that. There's obviously a greater challenge for us in that poem and in the repetition of those end words, this poem about the Holocaust. So that's our step 1, noticing that strangeness. A strangeness that he is constructing out of the most ordinary materials imaginable, those little, almost infantile monosyllables: home, day, camp, meal, walk, to. Why do they repeat over and over and over again? Well, precisely, of course, because those ordinary words have become strange and terribly, horribly strange to the speaker, the narrator of this poem. Those words tell the story of a memory he cannot escape, the memory of little Yolek shambling off to be killed in the camp. The speaker cannot escape that memory. He cannot escape the ceaseless repetition of those words. He can't even escape that memory or those words when he tries, as he is trying at the beginning of that poem, the little story that that poem sets up at the beginning. Where is he? He's gone camping, taking some he time, relaxing in the deep bronze glories of declining day, as he says, but precisely there and right there, when camping, it is brought back to him that memory of that other camp. So, that, I'm arguing, is the second very, very important part of this baseline approach to literature, to the study of literature, for which I'm arguing. It's where the ordinary business of text becomes strange, or perhaps, to put that even a little bit better, it's where we have the opportunity, or we receive the challenge, to perceive and maybe make some sense of the strangeness of that ordinary business. And that, I think, frankly, is what we do in the literary classroom, in the largest sense. And as I said in the very first lecture, I think that's a really, really big deal. Everywhere else in the university, everywhere else in our lives, we are, as it were, using text for the business of learning and understanding. In the literary classroom, uniquely, we try to understand exactly that business of text as a site of universal learning and understanding. You guys don't have to buy that. Frankly, you don't even have to kind of follow it. I recognize that we have been operating for this first sequence of lectures. We've been operating at a pretty high intellectual, really kind of philosophical level. I hope that has been interesting rather than, kind of bewildering. What I do really want you to consider, once again, and that's all, just consider, take on board the possibility. First, that we do not want to approach literature as something kind of mysterious and transcendent or beyond us. No. It's the most ordinary thing there could be. But second, it's precisely when we see the strange of the ordinary, that's when we give ourselves really interesting and useful work to do. As I was saying in the first lecture, it can be very useful to approach this question and this task of studying literature completely pragmatically. You have to write, let's say, X number of words about this poem or that play or that novel. How are you going to do that? Well, I've been trying to set up some ways to start doing that over the last couple of weeks, beginning again from finding the telling detail, finding the strange in the ordinary, and articulating it as such. Now, I want to finish up this lecture with two slightly longer and very, very famous poems on our syllabus. I'm not going to spend too much time on them because the point I want to make about them is not especially difficult. They're both very, very famous texts. I apologize very much for my cough, guys. Especially since I've fitted myself out with a mic for this lecture, and I'm worried that is going to make the coughing punishing on your eardrums. I'm sorry about that. Let's get through this for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. These two poems, one by Keats, Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and then a little bit of Walt Whitman from his long, unbelievably great and fantastic text called Song of Myself. And I want these poems here as our bridge toward the next part of our course. I want these poems here actually to be considered under that kind of pragmatic register. In other words, finding something to say, because that's what we have to do. And it's kind of a bad news, good news story, or a wrong way to do it, right way to do it story. One of these poets is presented with an object and says something about it, or tries to find something to say about it. And he is basically unable to find very much to say about it. I'm speaking about our friend John Keats. Oops. Shifting my balance here. Speaking about our friend John Keats in his very, very famous and beloved poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. This poem has Keats actually looking at an ancient Greek vase. That's what he's calling an urn. It's probably not an urn, but rather what classical scholars call a krater. And I did add to the Canvas page an Encyclopedia Britannica link on these objects, so you can have a look at them to have an idea of the kind of thing Keats is talking about. Greek vases of this kind, of course, they're completely covered in pictures. Pictures which tell stories drawn from the Greek mythological tradition. This poem, Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, finds the poet looking at one of these objects. So what does he have to say about it? Well, he says very, very famously, oh, and I will ask you guys to open up the text from Canvas and follow along on your own, please. Keats says, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme? What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals, or of both? In Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new, more happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. I'm going to pause my reading there. So Keats is looking at this Greek, ancient Greek vessel, this krater, what he calls an urn. It's covered in pictures of gods, of mortals, of people playing music, of people about to kiss, of trees, of a town, all this stuff. And you'll see it's kind of nice that Keats, he's sort of throwing questions at this object, right? Like, what is that? Who are you? Why are you there? he's asking the various elements of this urn. But the questions don't really go anywhere, you see? He doesn't pursue them. He doesn't try to make any sense of them. He doesn't try to make any sense of this urn. He just kind of looks at it and goes, huh, that's really nice. And I also put on the canvas page a little, very funny little poem by a man called Desmond Skiro. It's called Ode on a Grecian Urn Summarized. And it goes, it goes, God's chase, round vase. What say? What play? Don't know. Nice, though, which is a little bit mean to Keats, and yet not very, because he, in this very famous poem, this very beloved poem, is actually, I think, failing the test of finding something to say. And that's what I would write on his paper, I'm afraid. Failing the test of seeing the strangeness and doing something with it. And the reason he fails that test is because Keats already thinks he knows the answer. He thinks he knows the answer in advance to this artwork and every artwork. It's the answer that he gives in the final lines of this poem, still addressing the urn. He says, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That's all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Keats's faith, if you like. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. The urn to him just has to be beautiful. And that's all it is. Beyond that, beyond it's beautiful, what Keats basically comes up with is a kind of series of shrugs. And this, I'm arguing, serves us. And I'm sorry, Keats fans in the audience. Love the guy, but I hope the point that I'm making makes some kind of sense, because I think this poem serves us as an example of how not to find something to say, at least how not to find something to say that is actually going to allow you to say very much about the art object before you. In Keats's case, all he's really able to say is, that's beautiful. And as I was arguing in the very first lecture, fact is, even though it's true, fact is, that's not really saying very much. Okay, to finish up this lecture and the first module of our course, let's look at another kind of text. This little bit of Walt Whitman's great work, Song of Myself, from section 6, where Whitman looks at grass. And we don't have time to say very much about Walt Whitman. You will encounter him in American literature courses. Of course, he certainly was one of the most astonishingly creative, kind of mold-breaking artists in any medium who have ever lived and worked. In this little bit of text that I want to look at with you guys, a child brings some grass to Whitman. Shows him this grass, a handful of grass, and asks him to say something about it. This is next level literary classroom challenge, right? It's grass is probably what, you or I would say. Whitman writes, a child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name somewhere in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people, or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are, the mother's laps. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life, and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. Amazing. Keats looks at that urn, that amazing decorated artwork of ancient Greek culture, and all he's really able to say is, that's nice. Whitman looks at grass, and he is able to say, well, just about everything under the sun, up to and including coming up with what he offers as a proof of immortality. That's what comes out of the challenge of finding something to say for Walt Whitman. Now, Whitman is brilliant and may also be more than a little bit crazy, but let's just put it this way. We can take considerable inspiration, I think, from the brilliance and fecundity, let's say, of his attempt to find something to say, to see the strangeness and the wonder in something as ordinary as a handful of grass. If he can do that for grass, let's set ourselves a lesser challenge and suppose that we can do something like that for Sophocles and Homer and Shakespeare and Swift in this course. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this lecture there. Thank you very much, as always, for your attention. We now have concluded our introductory phase in this course. We're at the end of the beginning. We're going to be going forward to begin our look at our main texts, beginning with the next lecture. We will be starting with Sophocles' tragedy of classical Athens, Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex, and that's what I'll be talking about next time. Okay? Thank you very much for listening, you guys. Bye-bye.